Asterisk, when we talk about nations like India and the United States, we're not merely comparing economies or measuring military strength or ranking universities. We're asking a much deeper question: what does it mean for a society to thrive? Because prosperity isn't just about GDP, it's about whether culture can orient itself toward responsibility, truth, and individual growth. India, with its deep traditions and rapidly expanding influence, and the United States, with its historical dominance and its ongoing struggles, are both confronting the same fundamental problem: how to balance freedom with order, tradition with innovation, and ambition with responsibility. The real question, then, isn't just who is winning, it's what does winning even mean for a nation, and for the individuals who make it up. When we think about whether a nation is winning, the first instinct is usually to point toward numbers: GDP growth, technological innovation, military spending, global influence. These are visible indicators, and they certainly matter, but they are only surface-level measurements, and they can easily deceive. A society does not thrive simply because its economy expands or its corporations become powerful. True success is far more difficult to measure because it involves the character of the people who make up that society. A nation that produces citizens who are capable, responsible, and oriented toward truth will outlast one that is obsessed only with short-term wealth. If you look at history, societies that appeared wealthy and powerful often collapsed when their people abandoned responsibility. Ancient Rome, for example, was extraordinarily prosperous, yet its decline was not primarily economic, it was moral and cultural. The same pattern is visible in many fallen empires. Once citizens lose a sense of duty to their families, to their communities, to the truth itself, the structure of the society begins to weaken. Wealth cannot compensate for a lack of responsibility. A nation with irresponsible citizens is like a house built on sand. No matter how impressive the architecture looks, it cannot endure. Now, consider the modern context. If we look at India, one of the reasons its rise is being taken seriously is not just because of its growing economy, but because of the increasing emphasis on discipline, education, and collective responsibility. Young Indians are entering the global workforce with a mindset that values perseverance and long-term effort. That is a sign of genuine strength, because it means the society is cultivating individuals who can handle responsibility. By contrast, if we look at the United States, much of its struggle is not with external competition, but internal fragmentation. Its institutions are still strong, and its economy is still powerful. But when a significant portion of the population is disengaged, disillusioned, or caught in ideological battles that undermine responsibility, the long-term sustainability comes into question. It is not enough for a society to be wealthy if its people cannot shoulder responsibility. A culture that promotes entitlement over responsibility will inevitably consume itself. Responsibility is what gives life meaning because it connects the individual to something larger than themselves. It is also what sustains nations. When people take care of their families, when they build businesses ethically, when they work diligently, when they speak truthfully, they are not only improving their own lives, but also reinforcing the foundation of their society. So, when we ask who's winning, the deeper answer is this: the nation that will ultimately prevail is the one that produces citizens who voluntarily accept responsibility. It is not simply about having the largest economy or the most powerful military, because those things can vanish if the population loses its moral center. True winning is the creation of individuals who can bear the weight of life, and in doing so, ensure that their nation not only survives, but thrives across generations. India's rise in the 21st century is not an accident, nor is it merely the result of globalization or economic liberalization. At its foundation, India's strength lies in its capacity to blend ancient traditions with modern ambition, and in the discipline of its people who are striving to elevate their lives. A nation of more than 1 billion individuals is by definition complex, yet what stands out in India's trajectory is the ability of its citizens to harness population size not as a burden, but increasingly as an opportunity. This requires discipline, education, and a respect for tradition, elements that create resilience and long-term growth. tradition in India is not just a cultural ornament, it is a living structure that organizes life. In the West, tradition is often dismissed as outdated or oppressive, but in a society as vast and diverse as India, tradition provides order. It gives people a sense of continuity, of responsibility to family, of obligation to something greater than the self. That's not trivial, it is essential. A culture that remembers its roots can adapt without losing direction. India, with its spiritual and philosophical depth, continues to anchor its development in values of family, education, and perseverance, which are crucial for any society to endure. Discipline is another factor that explains why India's growth is being taken seriously. Millions of young Indians are working relentlessly to improve their circumstances through study, skill, building, and professional dedication. The willingness to endure hardship today for a better tomorrow is a defining trait of disciplined societies. This is visible in the growing number of Indian professionals excelling in global technology, medicine, and business. That is not a coincidence. It is the result of families and communities that emphasize hard work and sacrifice as pathways to advancement. Population, often framed as a problem, is in fact a source of potential power. A young and growing population means energy, innovation, and future productivity. If harnessed properly, India's demographic advantage could provide decades of growth that no aging Western nation can easily replicate. But a large population without discipline would only create chaos. The reason India is increasingly seen as a competitor to global powers like the United States is because discipline and tradition are shaping that vast population into a productive force rather than a destabilizing one. In contrast, consider societies where tradition is discarded too quickly, where discipline is viewed as oppressive, and where populations are shrinking due to a lack of commitment to family. Those nations may appear prosperous in the short term, but they face existential problems in the long run. India, on the other hand, is not only sustaining its growth, but projecting it forward because its foundation is anchored in values that encourage responsibility, perseverance, and a collective sense of purpose. The rise of India is therefore not simply an economic event, it is a civilizational phenomenon. A society that holds fast to its traditions while promoting discipline among its citizens is one that can transform population from a liability into an asset. That is why the world is beginning to take India seriously, not because it is becoming rich quickly, but because it is cultivating the cultural and human strengths necessary to sustain that wealth for generations. The United States still stands as one of the most powerful nations in the world, but much of its struggle today is not external, it is internal. Historically, America dominated the global stage with unmatched economic innovation, military strength, and cultural influence. For decades, it set the standard for freedom, opportunity, and prosperity. Yet, beneath this extraordinary legacy, cracks have begun to appear, and those cracks are not simply economic. They are cultural and ideological. The most significant threat to America's long-term stability is fragmentation, the increasing division of its people into hostile camps that erode the very values which once made the country thrive. For most of its history, the United States derived its strength from a unifying narrative. The American dream was not merely about material wealth. It was a vision that individuals, regardless of their background, could achieve success through hard work and personal responsibility. That shared story gave coherence to an extraordinarily diverse society. But when a nation begins to lose its common story, when its citizens can no longer agree on what binds them together, then the fabric of society weakens. That is precisely what America is struggling with now, the loss of shared meaning. Cultural fragmentation manifests in many ways. Political polarization has reached levels unseen in modern history, where dialogue is replaced by hostility and cooperation by tribalism. Entire communities are withdrawing into ideological bubbles, unwilling to even listen to opposing viewpoints. At the same time, debates over identity, history, and morality are tearing apart institutions that once provided cohesion, from universities to media platforms. A society cannot survive long-term if its people see each other primarily as enemies, rather than fellow citizens working toward a common good. This fragmentation also shows up in the decline of trust in government, in media, in institutions, and even in one another. Without trust, the bonds that hold a nation together unravel, and individuals retreat into isolation or cynicism. Economically, the United States is still immensely powerful, but an economy is only as stable as the people who operate within it. If cynicism replaces responsibility and division replaces unity, no amount of wealth can prevent decline. By contrast, nations that maintain cultural cohesion, even without vast wealth, often show remarkable resilience. That is why America's biggest challenge is not China or India or any other external competitor. It is the internal battle over whether it can reestablish a shared narrative, one rooted in responsibility, truth, and unity. Without that, the legacy of American strength risks being undermined by forces within. The paradox of the United States today is that it is still the wealthiest, most technologically advanced, and militarily dominant power on Earth, yet it struggles to maintain a coherent sense of identity. That contradiction cannot last indefinitely. For America to continue to lead, it must overcome cultural fragmentation and rediscover the values that allowed it to rise in the first place. If it cannot, then its immense legacy may not be enough to secure its future. Freedom is intoxicating. It gives individuals the power to make choices, to pursue dreams, and to shape their own destinies. Yet freedom by itself is unstable. If every person simply does what they want without boundaries, society collapses into chaos. Responsibility is the counterweight that makes freedom meaningful. Without responsibility, freedom devolves into selfishness and destruction. The balance between the two, freedom and responsibility, is the single most important factor in determining whether a nation can sustain itself across generations. When freedom is emphasized without responsibility, individuals begin to interpret life as a quest for pleasure, entitlement, or unchecked self-expression. They ask, "What can I take?" rather than "What should I give?" Societies that fall into this trap often experience cultural decay as personal desires outweigh collective duties. In contrast, when responsibility is emphasized without freedom, the result is tyranny. Individuals lose their agency, creativity is crushed, and society stagnates. Both extremes, chaos and tyranny, destroy nations. The key is balance, and it is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. This balance is what every thriving society must continually negotiate. India, in many respects, leans toward responsibility, with its emphasis on family duty, education, and collective perseverance. That provides stability, even amidst rapid growth and diversity. The United States historically leaned toward freedom, and that produced an explosion of innovation, entrepreneurship, and cultural influence that changed the world. Both models demonstrate the strengths of each value. Yet the danger for both nations is clear. India risks stifling freedom if tradition becomes too rigid, while America risks collapsing into chaos if responsibility is abandoned. The question of balance is not abstract, it is lived out in daily life. A free society only works if individuals voluntarily take on responsibility. Freedom is not simply the right to do whatever one wishes. It is the opportunity to shoulder burdens meaningfully. A student who uses freedom to avoid work fails, but one who uses it to study diligently transforms both their life and their community. A citizen who uses freedom only for indulgence weakens their nation, but one who uses it to build, create, and serve strengthens the foundation for everyone. This is true not only for individuals but for nations. The societies that endure are those that cultivate a culture where freedom and responsibility reinforce each other. Citizens must be trusted to act freely, but also expected to act responsibly. Governments must protect liberty, but also encourage duty. Families must raise children to dream boldly, but also to shoulder burdens. Without this balance, prosperity cannot last. Ultimately, the long-term victory of any nation is not measured by how much freedom it proclaims or how much responsibility it enforces, but by how effectively it can integrate the two. Freedom without responsibility leads to collapse. Responsibility without freedom leads to oppression, but when the two exist together, when individuals voluntarily accept responsibility while exercising their freedom, societies flourish. That balance is the true measure of a nation's strength. When a nation begins to replace competence and truth with ideology, decline is inevitable. Competence is the ability to do what works, what is effective, what solves problems in the real world. Truth is the pursuit of reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. Both are difficult, demanding, and humbling because they force individuals and institutions to confront error, limitation, and imperfection. Ideology, on the other hand, offers the illusion of certainty. It provides simple answers to complex problems, divides the world neatly into victims and oppressors, good and evil, and promises salvation through loyalty to a political or cultural narrative. But ideology, for all its emotional power, corrodes the foundations of a functioning society because it blinds people to truth and erodes the need for competence. History is filled with examples of nations that succumbed to ideology. The great tragedies of the 20th century, communism and fascism, were not accidents but ideological movements that elevated rigid belief systems over reality. They promised equality or purity, but what they delivered was suffering, violence, and collapse. Why? Because when ideology replaces truth, facts are ignored. When ideology replaces competence, positions are filled by loyalists instead of the skilled. Institutions cease to function, economies falter, and trust evaporates. A society in the grip of ideology begins to devour itself from within. In the modern world, this danger has not vanished. It has only taken new forms. In some places, it emerges as identity politics that fractures people into endless categories, each competing for victimhood status rather than striving toward shared responsibility. In others, it takes the shape of rigid nationalism or religious fundamentalism that demands blind loyalty rather than rational action. The specific form may differ, but the mechanism is always the same. Ideology substitutes for truth, and loyalty substitutes for competence. For a society to thrive, truth must be valued above narrative and competence above allegiance. That means encouraging people to speak honestly, even when it is uncomfortable. It means promoting merit, skill, and effectiveness, rather than rewarding those who merely echo fashionable belief. It means teaching citizens to think critically, rather than indoctrinating them into a single world view. These are difficult tasks because truth is painful and competence requires effort. But without them, the entire structure of a nation becomes hollow. The collapse of a society rarely begins with economic failure or military defeat. More often, it begins when people can no longer say what is true without fear, when institutions reward loyalty to ideology over actual ability, and when citizens value belonging to a group more than pursuing what is real. Once the threshold is crossed, decline is only a matter of time. That is why the true strength of a nation is not found in its slogans or political movements, but in its ability to cultivate truth, seeking and competence at every level, from individual families to schools to governments. A society that resists ideology and embraces truth and competence, however imperfectly, will endure. A society that fails to do so will not. The competition between nations is often framed in terms of economics, military strength, or technological innovation. But beneath all those measurable factors lies a deeper struggle, one that every society faces, the battle between order and chaos. This struggle is far older than the United States or India, older than modern politics, and older than history itself. It is the fundamental tension of human existence. Too much order, and life becomes suffocating, tyrannical, and stagnant. Too much chaos, and life collapses into unpredictability, conflict, and despair. The challenge for any nation is to continually navigate between these two forces, finding a balance that allows stability without suffocation and freedom without collapse. Order represents structure, tradition, and predictability. It is the set of rules, institutions, and cultural patterns that give people a sense of meaning and direction. A society cannot exist without order, because human beings need frameworks to guide their actions. Families, laws, religions, and educational systems all provide order. But when order becomes absolute, it becomes tyranny. Individuals are crushed under rigid systems, creativity is extinguished, and progress halts. A society consumed by order loses its vitality because it sacrifices the individual for the sake of stability. Chaos, by contrast, represents possibility, change, and innovation. It is the unknown that allows for creativity, exploration, and transformation. Chaos is necessary because without it, societies cannot adapt or evolve. Yet chaos, when left unchecked, destroys. If a culture descends into endless fragmentation, lawlessness, or moral relativism, then no one can trust one another, and nothing stable can be built. Chaos, when dominant, tears apart the fabric of civilization. Every thriving nation must live at the edge between order and chaos. Too far toward one side, and destruction follows. India, for example, with its vast population and diversity, constantly faces the risk of descending into chaos. Its challenge has been to maintain enough order through traditions, institutions, and national identity to keep that chaos from overwhelming the system. The United States, on the other hand, with its long-standing institutions and freedoms, has historically balanced both forces exceptionally well. But today, it risks falling too far into chaos, as cultural fragmentation erodes shared meaning and weakens national cohesion. The true contest, then, is not between India and the United States. It is between each nation and its ability to balance order and chaos. Nations do not fall simply because an external competitor defeats them. More often, they collapse when they lose their balance, when order hardens into tyranny, or when chaos spirals into anarchy. That is why this struggle is universal. What determines the future is whether societies can remain poised between these two forces, allowing the structure of order to provide stability, while leaving enough space for the chaos of innovation to drive growth. A nation that achieves this balance creates resilience, meaning, and strength. A nation that fails, no matter how wealthy or powerful, will eventually crumble. And that is the surprising truth. The real victory lies not in defeating another country, but in conquering the eternal struggle between order and chaos within one's own borders.